didn't even know what Zoom was until about 4 months ago.
Oh, it's amazing technology. If I had known about this years ago, my show would be a lot further on. Of course, I think it's a new thing. Yeah. All right. Thanks for joining me, everyone. Charles Moscowitz here. Welcome to the show. Mark Hyman is my guest. Mark is the author of several books: Pardon Gate, where I've had you on before, Mark, and Washington Babylon, which the subtitle of which is From George Washington to Donald Trump: Scandals That Rocked the Nation. Now, Mark, you're in a position to know something about this. Talk a little bit, if you don't mind, about your career and the shoulders you've rubbed, so to speak.
Well, I don't know if I've rubbed any interesting shoulders of sorts, but essentially my career is I'm a retired Navy captain. I served a total of 35 years of active and reserve service. I've served in the U.S., obviously. I've served abroad. I've lived and traveled in about 40 countries. After driving ships for about a decade, I moved into the intelligence side of the Navy. And when I left active duty, I ended up working for a couple of different intelligence organizations, um, most prominently Office of Naval Intelligence, the On-Site Inspection Agency, which is a disarmament treaty weapons inspection agency that no longer exists, but it was created to inspect primarily Soviet systems as part of the SALT and START and CFE treaties. Spent a lot of time in Europe, spent a lot of time in North Africa and the Middle East. When I left active duty as a civilian, I worked not only for intelligence agencies, but I also worked as a reservist for a number of intelligence organizations, including CIA, DIA, NSA, the National Reconnaissance Office. I bring all this up because my responsibility in life is getting to what I refer to as ground truth. What are the facts and figures? What is the absolute hard provable data? That's what it's all about. We live in a world where there's so much speculation and conjecture, and we can read it anywhere on blog posts, on websites, and news organizations and newspapers. And it's not about speculation and conjecture. There's a place for that, but that's not, it shouldn't be predominantly what we see as coverage. I'm about the facts and the figures. So my most recent book, which was just published a month ago, Pardon Gate, How Bill and Hillary Clinton and their brothers profited from pardons, I had nearly 850 endnotes. So people don't have to wonder where I got the material. I give them a roadmap. They can find the actual court document, the record, the testimony, the interview, the newspaper articles, and so forth. In my first book, Washington Babylon, I have almost 1,500 endnotes, and that includes newspaper archives from the early 19th century, court documents, again, interviews, a lot of hard material. So I just don't have information that people can read it and wonder where it came from. I give them a roadmap. I challenge them. And pardon.
It's okay.
We only have one phone in this house, which we never use. You know how it works? Because you can't get rid of the phone service because your cable bill goes up. You have to keep the phone.
Yeah, but you have to shut off the ringer. That's what I do. But
anyway, so my focus is always getting to the ground truth. So forget about the speculation. It's there. And I tell people, you don't have to wonder or speculate or whether I'm being honest or whether I have my facts straight. I tell you exactly where to get it. 1,500 endnotes, probably a little over the top.
Not at all.
But it should give people the confidence that the material is there. And sadly, we have too many in our line of work in journalism who say things that they can't back up with facts. So that's kind of my goal. And when it came to the first book, Washington Babylon, even though it's nearly 130 scandals throughout American history, as you mentioned in the subtitle, from George Washington right up through present day, they cover politics, sex, national security, military, financial issues, entertainment, sports. But to be honest, if it wasn't for politics and sex, it'd be a much thinner book. But it's a fun book. Even though it's about scandals, I call it an amusing read because most readers would be shaking their heads and going, are you kidding me? How can people be so dumb? And that's really what it comes down to, is people making a lot of bad decisions. And while a few people have done okay, most of the times they get involved in a scandal, it doesn't end well.
Right, because there's always some sort of a deception going on, and that once you once you tell a lie, you have to tell other lies to back up that lie, and you end up in this whole web of lies. I mean, it's part of life. I mean, it's part of personal relationships. It could be a part of a marriage, but in this case, it plays itself out on a national scale, and it can affect the whole country. It can affect politics, and of course, it happens. It happens all the time. That's why we have a system of checks and balances. That's why we have a free press and a free speech. You know, these are natural rights that the Constitution recognized, and the reason they recognize things like free speech and free press isn't so you could say fuck, you know. It's so you would, you know, it's so you would cover scandal, you would cover conspiracy, political conspiracy, economic conspiracy, attempts by people working together to do something illegal or to subvert something by presenting themselves as something other than who they are. And there usually is an element of it, like a seizure for power, or there is the covering up of some kind of an impropriety, whether it be financial or sexual or personal or whatever. And of course, this is threads our history because it threads everyone's life. It threads the world. I mean, this is
Hmm.
natural. That's why we have free speech. And yet, Mark, you make allusion to the fact that when someone like you comes along who is a practitioner of the very essence of free press and free speech, with investigation, with documentation, with evidence, with the presentation of a case based upon facts, then there's a certain amount of vilification that accompanies that when you do so in a manner that runs contrary to what might be called an establishment narrative.
Absolutely. Let me give two examples, and I have so much fun with these examples. Your listeners may recall in early 2001, kind of starting in the spring, rolling into the summer, it became known as the Summer of the Shark. As a matter of fact, there was a depiction of a great white shark on the cover of Time magazine. And pretty much all the networks and cable channels were doing hour or 2 hour specials on how shark attacks were out of control. And you name it, 2020 and Dateline and 48 Hours, all the networks were doing these shark attacks shows. And I was fascinated by that. And so I waited until the year was done. 2001 had it was over and done with. And there actually are a couple global organizations that track shark attacks worldwide. And 2001 was right in the average. There was nothing unusual about it. And the numbers are pretty pedestrian considering all the things that happen, considering all the people that are out there. And I don't hold me to the numbers, but off the top of my head, I'll say it was something like 17 was like the average over a 20-year period. And that was how many attacks there were that year. But once the echo chamber started, every news organization had to outdo the other with this is the year of the shark. It was on Time magazine, but there was no there.
Right.
Look at the numbers. Really? But everyone did these preposterous stories. Go to 2015, and your viewers can certainly do an internet search. It was the war on cops. It was an unbelievable war on cops. We've never seen the war on cops, all these attacks on cops. And it was in newspaper stories, it was in cable stories, it was in network news stories. It went on and on and on. You know that 2015 was the second safest year when it came to attacks on cops in the 65 years they were keeping records. Only 2013 had fewer police officer fatalities from attacks from citizens than
Mhm.
2015. But once someone started down that path, no one even stopped to look at the numbers and say, is it really a bad year? But that was the narrative, and everyone talked about it. Someone even, I won't even mention the name, but someone wrote a book that year about the war on cops. 2015 was the second safest year in 65 years since they've been keeping records of attacks on police officers. So I'm not anti cop. It's just let's get to the ground truth. And we tend, in my business, in journalism, we tend not look beyond a horizon that's more than 6 months old. Whatever happened last week, that's the narrative. We're going to carry on
Right.
with it. And it's so disingenuous, it's dishonest, and it's misleading to the public.
Yeah,
And
I mean, there's the news cycle, which is now 24 hours, and it's laziness. It's just jumping onto an easy story that attracts eyeballs, attracts hits, attracts traffic, and people just jump on that. There's also the example of people who will promote something for ideological reasons that turns out to be not true. And we could point to many examples. One that comes to mind is I had on this program Professor Christina Hoff Sommers, who wrote
Hmm.
from Clark, who wrote a book called Who Stole Feminism. And she talks about how a big story one year was that violence against women goes up during the Super Bowl. When men are there watching the Super Bowl, they're more likely to commit violence. And it had all these statistics, and it was a big national story, and there was lots of gnashing of teeth. She traced the origin of that story and found out that it went back to this somewhat radical feminist, you know, institution in Wellesley, Massachusetts, near where I live, and that they had completely cooked this thing. There was no evidence at all. And I only bring that up as one illustration that could be presented, and they are on both sides. I mean, I just interviewed the author of a book called Demagogue, which is about Senator Joe McCarthy, and clearly he also was cooking up conspiracies that were damaging to people and that were not well rounded for reasons of promoting himself. And so it's not something. It's just I'm pointing this up because there are people who have ideological orientations who will cook up various facts out of nothing in order to promote a story, and the media that might gravitate toward those views will jump on it and promote it and amplify it.
Oh, absolutely. I'm hazy on the details now because I'm over 60 and I tend to forget stuff. But
Me too.
your viewers may be familiar with this. Just a couple years ago, there was a big move to ban plastic drinking straws.
Oh yeah.
And there was a number thrown around, and I hate to repeat it because I probably get the number wrong. But when I saw the number about how many plastic drinking straws are disposed of each year, and I did the math, I thought, wow, that's something like the typical American using 6 straws a day, or something fantastic like that. It was an unbelievable number. So I began tracking the number back. Where did this figure come from? Eventually, I tracked it back to a 9-year-old boy who did a school project,
Yes.
and I interviewed his guardian because he was still a minor and this was a few years earlier that he come up with this number, but he just guessed. And his guardian said, well, he thought it was a good educated guess. And it went from this 9-year-old boy, and it sat out there for a couple of years, and then it got picked up. I think eventually the National Park Service picked it up early on for some reason. And that's not to say that we don't want to have drinking straws in the water, of course. But I listed the sheer number of mainstream news organizations that use that number, from CNN and MSNBC and all the networks and the New York Times and Washington Post, LA Times. The list went on and on and on. And it was a number that a 9-year-old boy said he guessed. That's
Huh.
it. And no one
And
thought to
you
ever.
uncovered that story, Mark? That's incredible. Oh, it
It
was
was
a
it,
national
it,
phenomenon. I mean, it
it was
created. And businesses, of course, are completely spineless. They're going to go with whatever pressure is applied. And I bring this up because, for example, Starbucks, in response to that story, decided to get rid of their plastic straws. But what did they do instead? They replaced it with a plastic top, which uses 10 times more plastic. So, I mean, the idiocy of it was astonishing.
Yeah, it was an interesting exercise. That's the second time I did that. I did a similar one about 15 years ago, and I'm vague on the topic now, but I just remember it was a number that I thought was difficult to believe. And when I tracked it back, it went to some advocacy group that simply estimated what this number was. But once it kind of got rolling, it snowballed. Everyone used the number. And I was stunned that there seemed to be nobody else in the news food chain who pumped the brakes and said, that number seems pretty fantastic. Let's fact check it.
Well, they
Instead,
didn't care. They loved it because it was this
it's,
fed to
it's,
this environmental thing, and it attracted audience. And your book is about goes through public scandals from Washington to Trump, and I think that on a political scale, we could take a look at a more recent example of the promotion of a conspiracy theory by people who had, I would argue, very ill intent, and that is that President Donald Trump was a Russian spy. And they pushed this was the evidence is now coming out thanks to the Durham investigation, and Attorney General Barr, that this was a deliberately hatched plot to discredit Trump before he was president, while he was still a candidate. And it was carried out with friends in the media like Rachel Maddow and others who were willing to put on the tin hat and push this thing every night. And it's been proven to be false, even by their own people, the Mueller group. Um, which brings me to my question about your book, Washington Babylon. What was the scandal about Trump that you talk about?
I actually had a couple of them in there. One was certainly the Russian meddling, and I wanted to let me address that for a moment
Sure.
because I had about nearly 130 scandals. It's nearly a 500-page book, but most scandals are 3 to 4 pages long. Some were a little longer. I was not able to cover the entire Russia collusion scandal, although I addressed some elements of it. And the manuscript went to the publisher on March 31st of 2019. And your viewers may recall that the Mueller report came out days earlier. And 4 days before my manuscript was turned in was when Attorney General Barr came out with his summary. And so that's what I addressed for part of it. But one of the things, because I was in the intelligence business for many, many years, I read a lot of intelligence reports. When I read the Steele dossier, I did make an editorial comment in a footnote and said it was one of the most cartoonish, most fantastical things I've ever read in my entire life. In the intelligence business, and I worked with the Brits. I lived in London and worked with the Brits, the Ministry of Defense and Defense Intelligence for a long time. I couldn't imagine anyone ever accepting that work. Not for a second. It was so childish and so cartoonish the way it was written. So that was a big data point for me right off the top. And since there was so little evidence, it came across as barroom chatter, which is what we've learned here in recent days, that it was basically cocktail chatter. That's exactly what it was.
Right.
But the thing I really wanted to hit was an issue that most people have never addressed. And we took the sanctimonious attitude that the Russians may have attempted to meddle in our election. There was a UCLA PhD researcher who came out with a paper in September of 2016. And he said that from 1946 until the year 2000, between the US and the USSR, the countries together had meddled in the democratic elections of other countries 117 times. 36 times by the Soviets and then the Russians, 81 times by the Americans. And that didn't even include things like the coup attempts the US engineered in both Guatemala and Iran in the 1950s.
Mm-hmm.
But typically, meddling in a democratic election, for the most part, involve things like news stories and pamphlets and maybe Voice of America, those sorts of things. And what I wanted to address was these sanctimonious high moral ground that some organizations took in this country, to how dare the Russians do this. This was business as usual. Throughout that period of time, from 1946 to 2000, the US averaged meddling in some democratic country's election once every 8 months. My point was not to criticize the US for doing this. What I underscored was every country works in their own best interests. The US, the Soviets, the French, the Israelis, the Brits, go right down the list. Maybe Cameroon might be the only country that doesn't, but everybody else does. And so to present this as if this is some unusual event was ridiculous. And people may remember that early in October of 2016, the original intelligence community report came out, said that, yeah, we think the Russians are involved and they're planning news stories in Sputnik and Russia Today. RT, Russia Today has now been renamed Russia Today. It has now been renamed RT. How many Americans rush to RT as their news source? Basically nobody. So what difference does it make? They were just news stories. They specifically said nothing was the election tallies weren't tapped into. No one manipulated the votes. All those things never happened. We now know, since the Republicans have had investigations, Democrats have investigations, and Mueller has had investigations. No collusion whatsoever. And I want to make one more point that no one really addressed in the Mueller report. So Mueller essentially said, we can't find anything, but I cannot exonerate Donald Trump. Ever since the founding of our nation, our legal system has rested on the presumption of innocence. Someone is presumed innocent when they are suspected, alleged, accused, arrested, indicted, and tried. They're still presumed to be innocent. The only time the presumption of innocence disappears is when they've been convicted. If they are acquitted, the presumption of innocence still exists. Mueller is an attorney. For him to suggest that you're presumed guilty unless we exonerate you is the exact opposite of our entire legal system. Everyone is presumed innocent until the day they're convicted. I don't care how much evidence there is. They're presumed innocent. So his whole premise, and that was just a construct in his part, because there was no there. So he
Right.
tried to find something. Actually, let me step back. Probably not Mueller, because I jokingly tell people the only person in Washington who never read the Mueller report
Was
was
Mueller.
Robert Mueller. Everybody else read it. I
That
don't think
became obvious during the hearings.
he had no clue what was in there. So he's simply just a puppet. He's a figurehead, and he's no longer with it. But the whole idea that you have to be exonerated to be deemed innocent is
Terrible.
contrary to our entire American history. So those are the points. And I think in that particular section, I called it meddling. It was probably 7 or 8 pages long. And I went into the detail
Right.
about the cartoonish report, the history of meddling in other countries' elections, and this whole notion of exoneration. So that was one of them. And I also addressed the Access Hollywood tape where
Mm-hmm.
he spoke, where Donald Trump
A
spoke
private
inappropriately.
conversation that was
Yeah.
taped.
But, and that perhaps any other figure, any other time, any other day, perhaps it would have sunk a campaign. But for him, he captured lightning in a bottle. And in spite of the fact that it was inappropriate conversation, it was offensive. You can go right down the list. In the end, he recovered from it. And so that was among the few where someone had a scandal in which they seemed to recover. Again,
I think
he's
it's
not the
because
only one, but
he publicly said that he was embarrassed by it and he apologized. It wasn't like he tried to spin or he tried to obfuscate. And just as one little thought about the Mueller thing, I mean, it looked very corrupt from the beginning because it was supposed to investigate Russian interference in the election, but yet it only focused on Donald Trump. It did not look at Hillary Clinton, did not look at Bernie Sanders. And I think that we now know in retrospect that there was more likely Russian interference to help Hillary, both from Russia and Ukraine. And in fact, the Obama administration should be viewed as a scandal for them as well, sending people over to Kiev to negotiate. I mean, there's all sorts of funny business going on their side, and Mueller completely ignored that, and it also set a very ugly precedent in the United States for how law enforcement should be done because when Mueller couldn't find anyone directly in the Trump administration, he went after some very small players like Papadopoulos and and people like that, and where they showed up at their house, with 25 guys dressed in ninja suits and CNN filming on the front lawn to arrest them and then drag them before publicly. I mean, this is an ugly spectacle that should never happen in this country, and it was all based on these so-called process crimes, anyways, things that were. He said that it happened in March 3rd when it actually happened March 5th, and this kind of nonsense. And this whole type of prosecution, which is really against the spirit of the American system, it kind of got started with Scooter Libby in the George W. Bush administration, where he was convicted for having said something happened on this time, not that time, and that the people involved in that conviction turns out to be pretty much the same characters that were involved in the Mueller thing. I mean, it's just this whole over prosecutorial approach for political reasons.
I actually now addressed the Scooter Libby prosecution
Yeah,
in Washington, Babylon, and and of course we now know that drawing a blank on her first name, Miller, the former New York Times reporter who was the
right.
key witness, and she now alleges that Patrick Fitzgerald, who was a special prosecutor, manipulated her testimony and flat out lied to her, and that also that the prosecution did not disclose exculpatory information as they should have according to judicial standards, and And so all that was totaled. And when she spoke to Scooter Libby's attorney years later, she wanted to know what actually transpired in the closing days before Libby got charged. And Libby's attorney claims that Patrick Fitzgerald said, "We will let Libby go if he delivers Cheney's head on a platter to us." And that's what the whole thing was all about. They wanted Dick Cheney, and they couldn't get Dick Cheney.
Yeah.
By the way, who appointed Patrick Fitzgerald as a special prosecutor? James
Mueller.
Comey.
Oh,
James
Comey,
Comey.
yeah.
James
And
Comey.
Mueller is Comey's protege, and this whole rotten group is still, they've got their fingerprints on all this stuff. I mean, the framing of Lieutenant General Flynn, it sort of sounds like they brought him in. No, don't bring a lawyer; it's fine, a private conversation. And then they caught him on some kind of technicality of, an inaccuracy. I mean, I've had on this program Dr. Jerome Corsi, and they said the same thing to him: is that if you deliver us Donald Trump, we'll let you go. Otherwise, we're going to throw the book at you. And he said, fine, look, I'm ready to go to prison. I'm not going to lie at this stage in my life. And he stood up to them and won. But this kind of like heavy handed, almost Gestapo like tactic used by people in positions of power is something that everyone, left, right, and center, ought to be concerned about. The liberals used to be concerned about this back in the day. But now that the shoe is on the other foot, they're happy. I mean, they celebrate when they trot, Michael Cohen out on, in chains out of his law office, and they ransack his office and his home. This
The
is great because they hate Trump so much.
I had a conversation with Floyd Abrams years ago, and he's a left-leaning attorney, but he's a staunch advocate of the First Amendment. And I asked him what was the biggest, if there was a change, biggest transition or change he's noticed in his entire life in dealing with the First Amendment. And he said in the 50s and 60s, it was the political left that were the big supporters of the amendment, the First Amendment.
Yeah.
And kind of the political right wasn't. He goes, they flip-flop sides. He said, even today, he's stunned that as a liberal, most of his liberal colleagues are so antithetical to the First Amendment, and his sparring partners on the political right are the ones who are the big believers of the First Amendment. He said that he never saw that coming, and it surprised him quite a bit.
Well,
I do mention
who's in power, right?
I have another story about Robert Mueller that's in Washington, Babylon,
Sure.
and without ruining the ending for your viewers, there was a case in which the FBI, wow, funny, the FBI once again involved in a bit of a scandal. The FBI was protecting Whitey Bulger, who was the Irish mobster, because he was supposedly a snitch for the FBI. Although in the end, he never really turned over any information. It was all worthless. But the FBI had assumed the attitude, it's better to have a Russian or an Irish mobster in charge than the Italian mafia. So as long as Whitey Bulger was turning over information regarding Italian mobsters, they were fine with him. And they turned a blind eye when Whitey Bulger and his crew committed violent acts, robberies, including murders. People may remember a couple FBI agents went to prison for involvement in murders.
Zip Connolly.
And what's interesting about this was there was a point in time where the FBI framed 4 Italian mobsters for murder in order to protect Whitey Bulger, whose crew was actually involved in the murder. They convicted 4 men, 3 of whom were given capital punishment,
yes,
or as sentences. 1 was given a life imprisonment term. Eventually, all 4 were resentenced to life imprisonment. And they spent decades in prison before they were finally exonerated when FBI documents came out. And it turns out the FBI knowingly lied and put these men behind prison in order to protect Whitey Bulger.
Right. And by the way, the young assistant DA at the time was none other than Robert Mueller.
That's right. And he's the one that went to the
I'm in Boston, so I know something about this.
He went to the parole board because when these guys had their first parole hearing, Robert Mueller showed up and testified and said they are vicious killers. There's no way you should ever let them out of jail. And to this day, we don't know how much, if any or at all, that Robert Mueller knew actually what transpired. But that was another case where the FBI absolutely broke the law and violated constitutional civil rights because they had a political issue they wanted to address. And I'm not a anti-FBI. I got a lot of friends who
No.
are in the Bureau, but I have several stories and everything from COINTELPRO, which was a 15-year program with the FBI that trampled on civil rights and constitutional rights and literally broke the law because they went after people they didn't like. And people they didn't like included whites and blacks, and Puerto Ricans,
Right.
as well as communists and socialists. They had a group they called the New Left. And when they testified in Congress, before Congress, they said, well, they really couldn't define what New Left was, but anyone who uses foul language could be part of the New Left. This was unbelievable. The FBI did this for 15 years. And then most of the records were destroyed at the direction of the FBI director, who was the guy who started the program 15 years earlier.
And who was that?
Um,
Was it J. Edgar Hoover? Was
no,
part of
no,
it,
no, no, no.
or after him?
I'd have to look at the book. I'm
Or
drawing a blank on
was
him.
it Kleindienst or one of those guys? I don't know.
Helms?
Helms, maybe.
Yeah, Helms. I think he was the original guy that started the program, and then he gave the direction to have all the records destroyed. When it became public, everything was destroyed. Years later, some information came out. There was some boxes that were mislabeled and stored improperly, and some information did come out about a decade and a half later. But Helms was a mid-level guy who was involved in starting the whole COINTEL program, and then later on gave the order to destroy everything.
Mm-hmm. And
So
and also when at the time, just one more vignette here about Bob Mueller, and he was the head of the FBI at the time of the Boston Marathon uh, bombing. And Congressman Stephen Lynch, who represents the district where that happened, wanted information that the FBI had about the Tsarnaev brothers and some other elements. And the FBI said, this is under Mueller, said, no, we're not giving it to you. We're not. This is a sitting congressman. I mean, this is our government. The FBI essentially was acting as a rogue agency at that point. They're under the authority of Congress. If they say, Stephen Lynch should have had them taken away in chains for that until they gave the information. But he said, oh, okay, fine. Anyway.
yeah, it's yeah, here's part of the challenge. When I left the intelligence business as a civilian years ago, I remember someone had asked me what were my contributing reasons why I left. And I said, one of them was the level of arrogance. And while I worked with some wonderful people and some talented and professional people, I said, the overall atmosphere, the level of arrogance that we're behind closed doors. We work with classified systems. No one's really going to know what we do. We can kind of do as we please. And I believe there's still some of that exists in the various law enforcement agencies. I actually have two neighbors who are retired Secret Service agents, and they're not exactly fans of the FBI because the FBI, when you have the law enforcement side, you have all this expectation of cooperation. The FBI would often stamp their classified material as secret LE only, LE meaning law enforcement, which was really code for FBI only. And the Secret Service, according to my two neighbors, said the FBI was the least cooperative of all the federal agencies I ever worked with, that they kept everything close hold. And there was really no, they claim, no rhyme or reason for it other than just they're going to do their own thing their own way. Certainly, I think it's fair to say the FBI needs to be revamped. I've only read bits and pieces since last weekend, I guess on Friday night, but when a lot of the paper dump came out regarding the Ghislaine Maxwell and Bob Epstein
Mm-hmm.
issue. And there are at least some of the top line reports I read was that both Mueller and Comey, both at Justice and at the FBI, were well aware that there was a pedophile ring going on and looked the other way. And the speculation is that maybe Robert Epstein may have had some sort of deal with the FBI because he'd been rubbing shoulders with all sorts of influential people, including elected officials and foreigners. And so were they looking the other way, much like they did with Whitey Bulger, because they thought there was a greater good to be served?
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of data seems to indicate what briefly I read, I haven't scrubbed it yet, was that the FBI knew there was a pedophile ring going on and chose to do nothing about it for years.
And also, I think there's evidence that Epstein might have been connected to international intelligence groups, including, unfortunately, the Mossad, which is a disgrace, but also British MI5 and other groups, and that the who was the Secretary of Labor, who was at the time DA in Florida, had to resign. He
Uh,
gave Epstein some kind of a sweetheart deal because the FBI told him to. They said, "Don't touch him because it's intelligence, and this is much bigger than what you know."
yeah, it's disturbing,
Acosta.
right?
Hmm.
It's disturbing that people will jettison any semblance of principle in order to achieve some sort of political aims. I get it. When you work with unsavory people, you have to accept that bad things happen. When I worked in the intelligence community back in the 90s, mid 90s, there was a big push by the Clinton administration to get some of our case officers um, disentangled from the bad guys of the world. But the only way you learn information about what the bad guys is up to is to rub shoulders with them.
Right.
Everything from cocktail parties to receptions to meetings to lunches to what have you. You have to have that relationship. That's what human intelligence is all about.
Sure.
They didn't like that. The Clinton administration thought that was offensive. So they said, you got to get away from bad guys. Don't even get near them. You have to kind of mix up the bad guys if you're going to figure out what they're up to. They're not going to
Right.
send you a postcard and say, oh, by the way, haven't talked to you in a while. We plan on blowing up this building next week. So you're going to find yourself in a difficult situation, and sometimes judgments have to be made. But it's hard to believe that when it comes to minor age girls, that the Bureau, if this is true, was
Hmm.
willing to look the other way for whatever reason. At some point, they should have pounced.
It
Um,
seems like you mentioned the Clinton administration. I mean, I've heard that the entire intelligence community atrophied during their years, and people tended to go to their desks, and they left the field, and they actually prosecuted a couple of people in the field who were trying to blow a whistle on certain things. And the result of that, to a certain extent, was 9/11. We didn't see it coming. We didn't have the intelligence assets out there to see these things because of that. So, as you say, you have to embed yourself into these things in order to get the information. But as far as the trafficking of young women and whatnot, that's I don't know. I mean, in a way, they had blackmail on these people, right? Including the very powerful around the world.
well, if you
Epstein was recording these things.
that's certainly the reporting that's been out there. That I don't know if it's true. It hasn't been laid bare to the public, but reportedly his townhouse, his palatial townhouse in New York, so apparently had dozens and reportedly had dozens and dozens of cameras in every room recording everything.
Right.
And you can imagine from Epstein's position, it was a perfect storm for him.
It was a honeypot.
Yeah, look, Bill Clinton, according to flight manifests that have been made public, had traveled on the Lolita Express like 26 or 27 times. He denies all that, of course. He thinks he flew twice or something like that.
Right. Right.
But he's been cited. Of all the people, I'm not sure Bill Clinton is the guy that people would give a pass to and go, oh, you know what? I don't think he misbehaved when it came to other women. He certainly has a long
Yeah.
track record. And Robert Epstein traveled in those circles, that he was on the political left. He was involved in that group of folks.
Right.
So, well, it'll be
And he
interesting to see what
probably
comes
had
out.
blackmail. I mean, blackmail is something that goes way back in American history. It's just part of human nature. You probably have some things about that historically. I mean, I've heard, like, for example, that Woodrow Wilson was being blackmailed in the White House because he had had an illicit affair between his the death of his wife and eventually his remarriage, and that there were letters, and that this was in the hands of some people who used them to get him to take certain positions in as president, including signing the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. And I'm not saying that's true. I don't know, but I don't know. Do you have anything on that?
I don't, not on Wilson, but certainly there are a lot of affairs in my book, and FDR was one of them. He carried on a over a 30-year affair with his mistress,
Rutherford, yeah.
and everyone knew about it, and all of their friends and even family members, and they just conspired to keep it secret from Eleanor Roosevelt, even though
Right.
she did catch him after World War One. Roosevelt had gone to the front and became very ill and came back, um, and had to recuperate. But in the meantime, Eleanor had found all the written love letters between Roosevelt and his mistress, and Roosevelt swore he'd never see her again. That was Lucy, but he did. They continued an affair for 30 plus years.
Plus, she
And
was having a lesbian affair with Lorena Hickok, according to letters that were released. So, I mean, it's a strange marriage, anyways.
yeah, absolutely. The
What
whole thing
else?
was
What do you have from going back into the 19th century that might be of interest?
well. Let me set this up for you. I received a phone call from Salon Magazine, and one of the reporters wanted to do a story on the book before it came out. So we set it up. He called me, and his first question was something to the effect of, well, since you've looked at scandals throughout American history, the current climate under Donald Trump has to be the worst, the most scandalous of all time, right? I said,
Hardly.
well, let me give you some perspective. I said, Robert Potter was elected to Congress from North Carolina in 1828. He had a young, attractive wife with whom he was kind of jealous that the attention she got. One day he snapped in August of 1831. He tracked down the two men he believed were having affairs with his wife, tied each one up, castrated each man, tucked them into their respective beds, summoned the local doctor to check up on them. And even then, the U.S. House of Representatives would not expel him from Congress. 20 years later, Congressman Philemon Herbert from California was having breakfast at the Willard Hotel in Washington, D.C., which still exists today. He felt his waiter was serving breakfast much too slowly. So he drew his pistol and shot and killed the waiter. Now, he did get charged with manslaughter, but was quickly acquitted in a trial because the jurors would not convict a member of Congress for shooting what they believe was the most despicable person in America at the time, an Irishman. And even then, Philemon Herbert was not expelled from Congress. So as I relayed those two stories to this reporter, I said, I would think mean tweets pale in comparison to literally castrating or killing people.
Yeah, not to mention the fact that Congress set up a slush fund with taxpayer money. This came out as a result of the Me Too movement, which basically pays off anyone making accusations of sexual impropriety by congressmen, both Democrat and Republican, and to keep it secret. So there's a lot going on. There always has been. I mean, that's just part of human nature. I mean, it's your job and our jobs as journalists and as people trying to investigate to expose these things. Of course,
By the way, so that reporter followed up with a second question, and he said, "Well, this was in October of 2019." He said, "Well, let's compare the Donald Trump impeachment with Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton." Now, I
hmm
wrote about both Johnson and Clinton's impeachments, but Donald Trump didn't get impeached until January. And so I responded. I said, look, I haven't looked at that. I know there's some speculation, but he hasn't been impeached. I did not look at that, so I couldn't comment on it favorably. He hung up. So all he really wanted was for me to bash Donald Trump. And I compared killing someone with mean tweets. And then I said, look, I don't know anything about the speculation about an impeachment of Trump over Ukraine because I haven't followed it. It's just I've been busy with the book. So he never wrote a story. It wasn't about the book. He just wanted to
right.
use it as an opportunity to bash Trump, which is a shame because I think his readers would have enjoyed it. I think your viewers, it's kind of a summer read of sorts. And I tell people each scandal is about 3 to 4 pages long. And if you get into a scandal you really don't like, guess what? In a page and a half, you're done. You're on to the next one. And
Good stuff.
it just covers everything. I talk about the Panama Canal and how that went down. And some of it was really fun. Um, the amount of research that went into it to write this book, I'm not sure it was a great return on investment. I remember when I worked on the section regarding the Panama Canal, I actually tracked down the autobiography of the original engineer, the French engineer who designed this thing. I wanted to read that to see what he had to say about it. I think I took a single sentence out of there that I footnoted, and I realized I basically spent a day in the library on a story that's 3 pages long to get a single quote. But I
Yeah,
enjoyed it. It was fun, and there were things that I learned throughout this. And out of the 100 and nearly 130 I have in there, I probably went through about 280 scandals. Some didn't work. Some I'd written on. I didn't like the way they flowed, and I took them out. As far as political parties, to this day, I've not counted them up, but my guess is when it comes to the two major parties today, they're probably an equal number of Republican and Democratic scandals. It's a nonpartisan
right.
book. There are 15 American political parties represented in this book: the Free Soil Party, the Know Nothing Party, the Whigs, the Federalists, even the straight arrow Federalists had scandals. Who knew?
Sure, everyone does. I mean, it's a great way to understand the forces of American history. I mean, I wrote a book similar that's self-published called Assassination in America, where I look at 32 cases of suspected assassination or known assassination or suspicion, going from Alexander Hamilton right up to the Clinton body count. And, it's just a great insight into what was going on politically at the time these rumors began. And I learned aspects of the even of the Lincoln assassination and the Kennedy assassination that I didn't know about in the course of my research.
Yeah, I
So,
don't know if you touched the James Garfield assassination, but I actually read Destiny of the Republic. I just finished that last week by Candace Millard. Unbelievable book. And I
right.
learned so much. And James Garfield has moved from the middle of the pack to near the top, as far as I'm concerned, when it comes to presidents. He
Oh
actually is
yeah,
the president we
totally.
need today. He was the first president that said, let's get rid of the patronage system. Let's make it all merit based. Let's
Oh yeah, no, he was a great man, and he was served in the Civil War. He was governor of Ohio. I did do a piece on that. The only thing I remember offhand was that the guy who assassinated him was part of this rather strange cult, the of Oneidas or something. He was part of this sort of collective movement,
yes,
and that
and
he was kicked out by them actually.
yeah. And I all I knew was that Garfield was one of those relatively anonymous presidents who was shot and killed. I didn't realize he lived for
Yeah.
2 months afterwards. The bullet never killed him. It
No,
was the poor medical.
the inspect the it's interesting. The one that I did that does stick out of my mind though was Zachary Taylor. He was a general from the Mexican War. He was in good health. He was at a banquet on the 4th of July. He had a bowl of cherries and some milk, got a stomach ache, went home, and 1 week later he was recovering, and then 1 week later he's dead. And the doctor that treated him was the same doctor that treated William Henry Harrison, and he was in Washington when Lincoln became president, and they said, "Oh, he's the presidential doctor." And Lincoln said, "Oh no, keep him away from me. He's already killed 2 presidents. I don't want to see him." You put him under house arrest. And that the situation around Taylor was interesting politically because even though he was a Southern slave owner from Louisiana, and his ancestor actually owns the Tabasco Spice Company, he was an enemy of the secessionists, which was a rising movement 10 years before the Civil War. When they threatened secession because Texas wanted to take over New Mexico, he said, "Oh, I'm going to get on a horse and lead the army in there. This is treason." And there were some people around him that I discovered who were very unsavory, and who I placed at that picnic, who turned out to be radical Southern secessionists 10 years later. So, anyway, his body was exhumed in 1998 as a result of inquiries from a retired history professor. And she got permission from his heir to exhume the body. They checked the body and they found arsenic. And there was no arsenic in the coffin, nowhere else. But the coroner said, well, there wasn't enough arsenic to have him killed. So, anyway, it's interesting. It's more interesting from the standpoint of looking at what was going on politically at the time of these questions, I found.
Yeah, it's I think it's instructive. It some things kind of go in circles. We see it repeat itself, and we realize, unlike the premise of this reporter from Salon Magazine who thinks that this current time period under Donald Trump is the most scandalous of all
Sure.
time. Nothing even comes close. Um, you know, gentlemen dueling each other or caning each other in the steps of Congress or in the floor of Congress.
Yeah.
It was a different time altogether. One of the stories I wrote about, which I found interesting, and I didn't realize this, was the story of Congressman Daniel Sickles, who was eventually was a Medal of Honor recipient during the Civil War. But Daniel Sickles also was one of those. In this case, he was the victim of what he thought was an affair his wife was having with Philip Barton Key, whose father was Francis Scott Key, who wrote the Star Spangled Banner. Philip Barton Key was also the U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C. And to make a long story short, where Daniel Sickles, congressman who lived just across the street, or just essentially a couple blocks away from the White House, on the other side of Lafayette Park, was convinced, or Lafayette Square, I should say, was convinced that Philip Barton Key was having an affair with his wife. And one day spotted Key out in Lafayette Square waving a handkerchief, which he believed was a sign to Sickles' wife. Sickles burst out of his home, strode up to Key, shot him, and killed him on the spot. And he was acquitted. He was the first person in the U.S. to use what was considered the temporary insanity defense. He was insane with the jealousy that this man was having an affair with his wife. And turns out it was the case. They did have, they were having an affair. And
He probably was signaling her.
And Daniel Sickles was acquitted. Eventually, was a general during the Civil War and received the Medal of Honor. Fascinating story, fascinating guy. And the relationship with the whole Francis Scott Key, it's just amazing.
Yeah. Anyway, Mark, again, your book is Washington, Babylon. We already talked about Pardongate, which I urge people to read. It talks about Bill Clinton's pardons right up to the moment he left the White House. Let people know where they can get your books or any articles by you or information.
Well, certainly they can go to my website at markhyman.tv. That's MarkHyman, markhyman.tv. Links there to a lot of stories I've written. And I think I have links to some of my television news investigations as well. The books are available anywhere books are sold. I think bookstores, for the most part, seem to be closed throughout most of America. So Amazon, Books A Million, Barnes and Noble, Simon and Schuster. I know I think if you ordered on either book today at Amazon, you probably get it in a couple of days.
Right.
I think Pardongate is the really exhaustive research into the pardons of Bill Clinton in the last essentially 18 months as he was president. Just a quick recap. For the first 6 years, he was one of the most stingiest presidents in all of history when it came to executive clemency. In his first 4 years, he only handed down 56 clemency decisions. Only Thomas Jefferson, the third president, handed down fewer, 45. Bill Clinton went from the stingiest to one of the most generous, beginning 2 weeks after Hillary Clinton announced she wanted to run for the U.S. Senate. And it became a free-for-all. In fact, in the closing months, it was so wild and wacky that Roger Clinton was cold calling clemency applicants, offering to get them pardons in return for cash payments. And people said, this one person I spoke to said, I don't know Roger Clinton. I never met him before in my life. How did he know I applied for clemency? That's not public information. And how did he get my private cell phone number? It's only on the application. Well, clearly Bill or someone at the direction of Bill gave a list of names and numbers to Roger to hustle for pardons. And as far as Washington Babylon, published at the end of 2019, I call it a fun and amusing read, even though it's about scandal. You got to shake your head. Even though there's Watergate, NAB scam, scandals that people know, Teapot Dome, they know is a scandal, but most people don't even know what it is. But I talk about it in there, as well as all the scandals that were once the big stories of the day and faded to obscurity. And I was surprised how many times I'd read about some type of scandal, sometimes resulting in a murder, in which the newspaper headline said trial of the century. So I read a lot about a lot of trials of the century. And they get eclipsed by the next trial of the century.
Sure. There's a whole long line of them. All right, Mark. Listen, again, thanks for joining me. Great fun. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Charles. Appreciate it.
All right. Take care.